Our next panel will be on scaling up the pandemic preparedness and the response. And I'm very excited to call our next three speakers on stage. They've been hard at work working at addressing the pandemic. We have Dr. Chikwe Ihekwesi, the Assistant Director General from the World Health Organization, Jumana Kamdran, Senior Health Specialist at the World Bank, as well as Dr. Richard Hatchett, the CEO of CEPI. Thank you all for joining us, and you may take off your mask, although maybe there are some strict WHO rules we have to follow. But thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation and really excited to have this conversation with the three of you because you guys are doing so much work on this and you're also doing work in different spheres. So first of all, like I mentioned earlier, COVID was a catalyst for so much innovation. What were you guys excited about in terms of innovations that came out of the pandemic? And Chikwe, I'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Ruby. I think what happened during this pandemic is really incredible, right? We moved from a space where, where people working in this space were really at the bottom of the pyramid. Nobody knew who we were. We're fighting to get any type of resource at all to do anything interesting. To the stage where, on the innovation side, there was just a flurry of activities. There were apps for everything from contact tracing to surveillance, investment in laboratory infrastructure, in the supply chain, in every space from financing to technology to governance. Countries have been innovating in solutions. I think what happens in cases like this is that because everything was so organic, there wasn't any real coordination in leveraging the separate different innovations happening to create the outcomes that we need. And really that's why WHO in its wisdom, the leaders, put together this new idea of setting up a new pandemic hub in Berlin. Is in the private sector, there's a clear pathway from innovation to value, generally. In the public sector, you really have to think about how to align the incentives that the innovators can bring to create public health value. So you have to actually have ways of managing that and curating that in order for us to derive value. I'll give an example. Many countries at the moment are digitalizing the surveillance architecture, the surveillance systems. There are 1,000,001 options, open source, proprietary, systems available out there that people are innovating. Everyone is creating new apps, thinking it's easy to do, but it's very complex. And, in WHO, we never had an opportunity to advise countries on how to do this efficiently, how to choose what systems and all of that. So part of the work we're doing in the new hub is to make sure that WHO is really moving into this century, delivering that advice for countries, enabling the various innovative opportunities that have come into the space, derive long-term value, and give value to the people working in this space around the world that have been ignored for years, and suddenly, we don't have to explain what an epidemiologist means anymore. Everyone on TV is one these days, and on social media. But it's a good thing. What we need to do now is think very carefully on how to come together as a global community and make sure it serves the purpose that we want of keeping the world safe.
Yeah, epidemiologists are now the new rock stars of the world, which is very interesting. So Jumana, I'm going to add on to my question. I did ask what kind of innovations you're excited about, but in addition to that, what kind of lessons did you learn? And I think this will be interesting on the financing side. What kind of lessons did you learn?
I think, well, a couple of things. I think the idea of risk and taking risk, even big organizations like the World Bank, we took a lot of risk. And organizations that before hadn't had different types of partnerships came together and really kind of organized and collaborated in new ways. So this element of risk is, I think, really important, and being able to increase the risk appetite for this pandemic and for the future. The other piece that I think is really important is that equity has to be central. It can't be a nice to have or a thing that you think is going to happen somehow if you do all of the things that you do. So that's another piece. How do you centralize equity? And a lot of that I feel is around really bringing in this idea and operationalizing people-centered care, not just for the end user, but also for the frontline health workers. And I think that's a big piece. And linked to that, I think really strengthening primary healthcare systems and integrating COVID-19 interventions and innovations into that system. We have a lot of innovation right now, as you're saying. We have a lot of things, on the vaccine side, on the manufacturing side. Well, our thing is, right now, one of the key issues is like how do people uptake? How do they bring this, how do you get people to use a lot of these interventions for COVID-19? And I think when you build people-centered systems that are connected and distributed and digitized, then that is useful for this pandemic, but then also for future public health threats and for other health issues.
Yeah, when I think about preparing for the next pandemic, Richard, I always think about the 100-day goal, and it seems like it's a big one, right? So what were you excited about, and what kind of lessons have you guys learned during this period?
Thanks. Well, let me build on some of Chikwe's comments and Jemana's comments. On the innovation side, I would say there are multiple streams of innovation, obviously. Chikwe mentioned some of the technological innovations in the vaccine field where CEPI works. We have validated a number of new rapid response technologies that delivered vaccines faster than they had ever been delivered before. 11 months from sequence to the first approval by a stringent regulatory authority. But that clearly wasn't fast enough, and that's where the 100 days comes in. I'll come back to that in just a minute, because there are a couple of other areas of innovation that aren't quite as visible as the mRNA vaccines, for example. There's also been institutional innovation. I think COVAX, which CEPI worked to help conceptualize and then lead, was a huge institutional innovation. The Financial Intermediary Fund that is coming out of the pandemic is an important institutional innovation. Some of those, like the Financial Intermediary Fund, are going to be enduring. COVAX has a limited lifespan, and we need to figure out how we can preserve the elements that are important, carry it over into routine delivery of COVID vaccines, for example, but also preserve the parts that are peculiarly related to the pandemic response, and figure out, do we put those on the shelf? How do we keep those live so that if we need them again in the future? The last area of innovation, and again, this is where the 100 days comes in, and I'll finish with that, are conceptual innovations, and I would say even validation of some preparedness ideas in actual practice. One of those ideas is this idea of doing preparedness work in terms of vaccine development in advance of a threat's emergence. And so one of the things that allowed us to respond very, very quickly in terms of the vaccine response was prior investment in understanding how to develop vaccines against other coronaviruses, against SARS and against MERS. And the mRNA vaccines as a technology could not have delivered vaccines as rapidly as they did without that prior investment in understanding how to crack the code, as it were, for vaccine development. And so one of the conceptual innovations that we've embraced and that is folded into the 100-day mission is this idea that we were prepared for coronaviruses as a viral family due to 10 or 15 years of prior investment in science. And we had worked with rapid response technologies like mRNA, like the ChAdOx technology that Oxford pioneered and that became the basis of the AstraZeneca vaccine, trying to develop MERS vaccines. We are not prepared for many of the other viral families that represent threats, and we have to have a global R&D concerted investment to make sure that our preparedness for future threats is broad. Then once a threat emerges, we need to be able to deliver vaccines much more rapidly than we did in 2020, and that's where our concept of, can we compress vaccine development down to 100 days? What does that mean? How much of that work has to be done in advance? How much work with regulators has to be done in advance? How much can we take new models of clinical trials and new models of regulation and change the paradigm for rapid delivery of vaccines?
Thank you so much. I do want to pick up on some of the things that you did say on investment, but at this point in time, I'm going to take a question from the audience. It's actually a recorded question. We've got a question from Elizabeth Ashbourne, who's the Executive Director of PQMD. I'm sure she should pop up on that screen.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Ashbourne, Executive Director of the Partnership for Quality Medical Donations, a global coalition of leading international NGOs, pharmaceuticals, and medical product companies. Our members provide essential health-related donations to governments and communities around the world to respond to global crisis, humanitarian disasters, and increasingly long-term sustainable access to quality healthcare. At PQMD, our members know that the first rule of disaster preparedness is to have your partnerships in place prior to a disaster hitting. You don't want to be vetting partners, understanding the local actors and landscape, and building trust when you are in the middle of a hurricane, earthquake, man-made disaster, or responding to a global pandemic. These partnerships, and I mean true partnerships, where all stakeholders have a seat at the table, including multilaterals, NGOs, private sector, civil society, faith-based groups, ministries of finance and health, and others, need an upfront investment in times and resources to harness their creative energy, ensure health equity, and leverage the power of their expertise, a power needed to take most things to scale. PQMD members, often competitors within their fields, have spent years developing this level of trust and mutual partnership. So my question is, the next pandemic may be around the corner, and we know that as we come out of COVID, there were many bureaucratic and competitive barriers that impeded or at least slowed response times. What are your organizations doing to accelerate these types of trusted partnerships essential to a well-coordinated and successful response, needed to bring life-saving technology to communities and potentially populations around the world, and ensure that all stakeholders are prepared to respond collectively in early days and throughout? Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So Jumana, we'll start with you. What is the World Bank doing?
Okay. I'm going to try to answer this in 3 minutes. So I think, during COVID, and I just want to give the example of the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Trust and the partnership that built around that. I think a couple of big things that happened during COVID is that the idea of regionality really came to the fore, right? So there's country investments, there's global investments that are really important, but this idea of strong regional institutions and building or starting to build capabilities and preparedness across the board creates an ecosystem in which you can have deeper engagement at a more, again, distributed level, right? So the bank has been doing a few things, which I think is really exciting. We've intensified our investments with regional institutions, and really from all aspects, not just in the public sector, but the private sector as well. And we see this really as a critical avenue to ensure that, that investments in preparedness are both sustainable, equitable, and impactful at the end of the day. The other thing that we're doing is that we're really thinking about how to finance differently. So you raised the piece about the financial intermediary fund. I think this is something that's really, really important because it's the first fund of its type. It was approved overwhelmingly by our board on June 30th with a lot of work from the G20 countries, partners like WHO. And really, this is the first fund of its type that's incentivizing upfront and long-term investments in preparedness by countries and regions. Critically important. And then the next piece that I will say is this idea that I think, I'm just going to use Africa CDC as an example, but this idea of building regional and sub-regional capacities. So for example, networking, surveillance, and laboratory building and networking that, shortening supply chains. thinking about manufacturing and R&D in the short, medium, and long term. I think when you bring that locus of action closer to countries, that gives the kind of the loops where innovation and kind of interaction and connection can happen. It makes it much more efficient and effective. So having civil service, having civil society, having all of these different types of groups really be able to interact in a meaningful way and really inform the agenda as well as benefit from it is really, really important.
Thank you so much. And Richard?
So no, I think the points that Elizabeth was making are really important. There's an old saw in the emergency preparedness field that you don't want to be exchanging business cards at the site of a disaster. And I think the point that she was making about building long-term relationships and long-term capabilities is critically important. And so some of the relationships were definitely strengthened through certainly at the international level, were strengthened through the response to COVID, through the development of the ACT Accelerator, the establishment of COVAX. Our relationship, for example, CEPI's relationship with WHO and with Gavi and UNICEF became much more profound, much deeper, many, many more touch points. And I think those will endure. Where the response kind of fell down, frankly, and this has been the main challenge in 2022 where vaccine delivery is concerned, is that the delivery mechanisms were not as practiced, and they had to be kind of assembled on the fly, and that has introduced real challenges in getting vaccines to underserved populations. And we need to emerge from the pandemic and think about how can we embed these capabilities, which are sort of the core of resilience in the everyday delivery of healthcare. These aren't things that we can put on a shelf and dust off when we need them. They have to be embedded capabilities at the country level, at the local level. And if we don't succeed in doing that, when the next crisis comes along, we will stumble in the same places.
Thank you. You mentioned exchanging business cards at the site of the disaster, and one of the things that I enjoyed from some of the remarks during the pandemic are all the warnings that we're getting, and a lot of my favorite ones are actually from Tedros. And one thing that he said was, the time to fix the roof is before the rain comes, not in the middle of a storm. Mm-hmm. So what is WHO doing to make sure they have these partnerships in place right now?
Oh, thanks, Ruby. I think even before we get to what WHO is doing, is to think of what the frontline responders are doing every single day. So when we think about pandemics, sometimes the imagery, it appears that we see a pandemic coming and we know it's a pandemic from the beginning. In real life, it never happens that way. There are a group of colleagues in every country at the subnational levels that investigate some signal every single day, right? It might be a cluster of new cases of fever, sometimes a cluster of deaths. Each of those incidents can turn out to be an epidemic and then a pandemic. Someone has to respond, make an assessment, decide, will this be, should I act, should I not act, should I call the minister, should I send a team, should I deploy vaccines? And the better we get that bottom of the pyramid activity happening, and happening well and effectively, the safer we all are. So all the three organizations that we lead really work to a large extent at the top of the pyramid. So what we need to do is focus a lot of our work at the bottom as well. And WHO is uniquely placed in that regard because actually as a member state organization has offices in 194 countries. And our primary responsibility is to support countries to develop that capacity to do that every day, every single day. And in the organization itself, we detect about 5,000 signals every month that could end up being an epidemic. Most of them are never heard about because they're well-managed, countries are managed and supported to do this. What is changing now and what we're trying to do is really be more intentional in creating what we call a new trust architecture for the future. The financing is important, of course, the ability to develop countermeasures rapidly is important, but if we don't shape our countries, our community in an environment of trust where we're ready to share this information, even regionally, even under the Africa CDC umbrella, you can't mount a response, and nobody wants to wait till there's a big incident before we do so. So building trust takes time, it's hard, it takes working together in peacetime. You can't do it in the middle of a pandemic, like Richard said. It takes every day building those opportunities to meet, to discuss, to engage, and to define those risk levels. So I think that's really what we're trying to enable happen through the new hub and other bits of the new health emergency architecture that we're working with all the sister organizations to create, to really create this community of practice that sees itself as an ecosystem that starts from the bottom to the top and is cyclical, because that work actually happens every day. It's not something that starts and stops and ends and waits for the next pandemic to happen. The 90% of the people that do this work do it every single day of their working lives and just need to be supported to keep doing it better.
Thank you. I actually like that very much, a bottom-up approach. We are left with 3 minutes of the conversation. So I know, surprising, right? We've been having fun, I guess. So in 1 minute, I would like you each to give your key takeaways. Richard, I'll start with you.
Okay, I would say my key takeaway, building on the comments here, is that any chance that we have of defeating future pandemic threats will depend on the types of on-the-ground capabilities that Chikwe was describing. It will depend on early detection, early, effective, rapid public health response to contain, and early delivery of definitive countermeasures, diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccine. And if we can do those three things, which require success at all levels of the pyramid, then we actually have the potential to prevent future pandemics, and they are coming.
Thank you. Jumana?
I think this idea of really intentionally and into the long term building these ecosystems and these enabling environments for innovation and for preparedness capabilities to be across the world. I think then you have a way to network global, country, and region, right? These are all very important things. So having development happen is really important. Getting development out in an equitable and fast way is critical. So building those systems now has to happen. And I have to say it, equity, equity, equity. And ensuring that is the leading edge in which we are kind of moving forward.
Equity, equity, equity. And Chikwe?
Yeah, and putting that equity into practice means that we have to really socialize, internalize that we're interdependent on each other. And these are not problems you can solve in our small bits. And we've done that in many other sectors. When you enter an airplane, you don't worry whether it's an American plane or a South African plane or a Russian plane. You enter the plane. And the financial sector works because people collaborate. So there are many other sectors where frameworks for collaboration have been agreed because we understand that if there's a crash in the finance sector in one part of the world, it affects all of us in the rest of the world. We have to really internalize that this is what equity means in the work that we're doing, that you can't solve this problem in one bit. So we're putting forward a new concept of collaborative intelligence, collaborating across regions, across disciplines, across professions, and really, we're in this together. And that's really, if we leave this pandemic feeling that we can do this without the other, we've failed. We're really in this together.
I think that's actually a great point to sort of end this conversation. We're in this together. I want to thank each one of you for joining me for this panel. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed having you here on the Devex stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rumbi. Thank you.
Thank you.